So when we're talking about the backswing for a golfer, what that actually is a representation of early propulsion.
Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Wow. Today is Wednesday. That means that tomorrow is Thursday. So we have a coffee and coaches conference call at 6 a.m. On Thursday morning. So please join us for that. The link will be on my professional Facebook page early tomorrow morning prior to the call. These calls have been getting really, really good. Big group of people, lots of great questions, and we've just gone long because I'm having such a good time with those. So please join us for that. Digging into the Q&A for today. Today's Q&A is with Jason. Jason's a coach, had some questions in regard to the superimposition of ERs and IRs, and we used a golf swing as a representation for that. So if you work with golfers or rotational athletes, you're going to find this interesting because we also had to discuss the influence of yielding overcoming actions and how that creates the important elements of the turn. We even got into some structural issues and how we determine who's best for what type of activities, and if they choose to do certain activities, how are we going to best train them and select the appropriate interventions to do the best that we can under certain circumstances. So again, this is a really, really good call. So Jason, thank you so much for your participation. If you would like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, please email me at askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com. Put the 15-minute consult in the subject line so I don't accidentally delete it. All right, gotta run. It's Wednesday, always tight, always busy. I will see you guys tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. on the Coffee and Coaches conference call. Have a great day.
Camera is running. Clock has started. Jason, what is your question?
My question is based off what I've learned from your model so far in my reading and just everything that I've gathered, is when you talk about an ER hip shift or something that would be equivalent to loading into a cut, or the examples that I used in the email question was a pitcher loading up on their trail leg before they're about to throw a baseball, a golfer at the top of their backswing, any of those examples, based off what I've learned, you've considered that an ER hip shift and a certain musculature lengthening and other musculature shortening to load the movement per se. Yep. I'm really having a hard time understanding what muscles are doing what job, and it's kind of put me in a little bit of a confusing spot because based off previous information that I've learned, they don't mix. So I just want to learn.
Okay. All right. So let's use the golf swing because I think it's a little bit easier to see.
Sure. Okay.
Right? So a couple of simple rules. We have to have an external rotation space to superimpose internal rotation on top of it because they happen at the same time. They are not separate entities. They are superimposed. Okay. So external rotation creates somewhere to go. Internal rotation gets us there. Okay. So that's how I want you to look at this. And again, because we got two ends of the golf swing that are somewhat similar, it's very, very, very easy to see. Okay. Now, so we have an external rotation position that is represented in the pelvis that we want to talk about. And so what this is this would be the counter-nutated representation of the sacrum against the ilium. Okay, that would be our representation of what the ER looks like. And so I actually have my pelvis handy, so I'm going to show you. Okay, so it's going to be that relationship there. So I have the counter nutation of the sacrum, so it's moving back relative to the ilium, or the ilium's moving forward rather on that. So I have two representations. I can use the ilium to push in that direction, counter nutation, or I can move the sacrum back. So when we're talking about the backswing for a golfer, what that actually is a representation of early propulsion. So we're actually talking about how we take a step forward. Okay, so an early propulsive representation is ER, it's counter nutation, but it's the sacrum moving back relative to the ilium. Okay. So what's creating this? So it's actually a delay strategy. So what happens is, if we talked about the left hip in the backswing, this side is actually going ahead of the right hip. So to create the delay on the backside hip, if we're talking about a right-handed golfer, we're talking about the right hip, okay? So under this circumstance, to create the delay there, what I'm actually doing is creating a yielding action via the connective tissues. So I'm already in an ER representation, but to create the delay, so this side has to go slower than this side, otherwise there would be no turn. So to create a turn, okay, both sides are in ER. One side is overcoming, which creates the turn away from this side. So on the left side, I have an overcoming action of those connective tissues, which moves that hip forward. This hip creates a delay and it moves back. That's what creates a turn. So if I'm at the, oh yeah, the light bulb just went off, right? Okay. So as I take the club back, and again, I'm talking about right-handed golfers, as I take the club back, this side actually has to slow down relative to this side. That's what we connect. So connective tissues behave based on rate of loading. Okay. And so the position is ER. Okay. And then I create the delay, and that creates the space for which I can turn into. And then that's where we superimpose the IR on top of it. So if I don't have an ER space, if I don't create this delay strategy on this side, I can still orient the whole pelvis as a whole, but I'm using a compensatory strategy to do so because I don't have the relative motions available. So what I have to do then, Jason, is I have to create relative motion somewhere else. Sometimes I can just create it right there at the hip joint, but this is where you're going to start to see the foot change in the ground, because the foot has an early propulsive representation. The pelvis has an early propulsive representation that match. So if I don't have my true early representation where I have a yielding action here on the back side of the pelvis, I don't have that representation in the foot anymore. So the foot's going to move as a single unit. The pelvis is going to move as a single unit. And so that's where you start to see people roll to the outside edge of their foot. Right now, I have to create internal rotation somewhere else. And I'm going to usually do that by an orientation where I'm going to tip the pelvis forward. Okay. But again, this just creates a cascade of compensations where instead of having relative motions to allow me to capture these positions, I'm using absolute orientations where I'm blocking multi-segmented areas into a single segment of motion. And now I actually reduce my ability to create turn. It's like I can orient myself, so I can make myself right facing. Yeah. But I'm not creating the segmental relative motions that I would use for a controlled segmental movement that which is what is desired when we're talking about these activities. So I can acquire effective positions that allow performance to be consistent. Because what happens is, under the circumstances where I'm locking things into one piece, I get way too much signal, not enough noise. And so I can't make the small adjustments that I would normally make to smooth out movement. And so like when you get like a golfer or a baseball pitcher that doesn't have these little segmental movements, what you see is inconsistency with ball contact if I'm a golfer, or inconsistencies with the release point of the baseball if I'm a baseball player. Okay, because these little adjustments here, these little relative motions that I do have available to me is what makes sure that I am consistent, because I can make these small adjustments and it doesn't require any thought. It's just the connective tissue behavior allowing me to capture these consistencies. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That breaks it down. I'll definitely have to kind of swim in this train of thought for a while too, to get it, but that does make sense.
Yeah. So people think that muscles are doing everything when the reality is it's like we rely on connective tissues to do amazing things when we're talking about force output, when we're talking about velocity, and especially when there's a time constraint. Connective tissues are the monster that has been ignored in how we actually produce forces. So it's a kind of a big deal. So the muscles are going to assure that we're in the right positions, but then it's the play of the connective tissues that are going to create the delays. And so when I talk about yielding actions, we're in an energy storing action of those connective tissues. And when we're in an overcoming situation, we're in an energy releasing situation. So yielding tissues are a little bit more expansive. They stretch. The overcoming tissues are a little bit stiffer. But again, that's where I'm really producing that high element of velocity. It's actually going faster in the overcoming situation and slower in the yielding. And that's how you turn, right? Like you can use muscles to turn you, but it's going to be incredibly slow. Connective tissues can turn you very, very quickly.
When you are referring to connective tissue, is fascia part of that?
Everything that's not an internal organ or the contractile muscle tissue, everything outside of that counts. All of that matters. All of that matters, right?
That would change the way a lot of coaches think about how they train for power, I think. So,
well, so hang on. It changes how you think about it, but it doesn't change the activities, but it makes you better at selecting the appropriate activities for the athlete.
Sure. Yeah. Because I'm already kind of going in my head, like thinking, Yeah.
You bounce across the ground on connective tissues. You don't bounce across the ground on, like, the muscles capture the position. So the muscles are what maintain the position, right? The connective tissues is what's producing the action.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. That's good. Yeah.
Well, it is. And when I did a little talk, I think last week, about stretch shortening cycle, because they've always looked at the tendon as doing all this work. It's like, let's not forget about all the other connective tissues here, because they're all getting loaded at the same time, and especially the skeleton. The skeleton becomes very, very important when we're talking about really, really high force or high velocity activities, because it can store and release more energy than everything else because it's stiffer.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit more to deform it. Right? It takes a high force to deform a bone, but if you can deform it and it doesn't break, right? You got to be that's a representation where the bone gets way too stiff too quickly and it snaps just like silly putty.
Sure.
But the reality is that we really have to start to appreciate how we're thinking about these things, because again, it helps us select better interventions. Because if I'm thinking that I'm changing muscle, when the muscle is literally there to create a position, and then I'm not appreciating how the connective tissues behave, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, that changed. Yeah, kind of. It gives me enough to think about for the next week. So,
so here's what I would recommend that you start to think about is like you start to think about, okay, I'm using my muscles to capture a position, right, and then the connective tissues, right, to identify what activities I'm going to use. The higher the force output that's required for that activity, the stiffer the connective tissue I'm going to be utilizing. Okay, so if my time constraint is brief, okay, I'm going to use something that is easier to deform. Okay. Right. It's like a shorter amount of time at high velocity. So it's not a high force kind of thing. Like sprinting is very high force into the ground. Right. Okay. Yeah. But throwing a 5-ounce baseball is a little different.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess I'm looking at the clock here. It's 2 minutes. I guess I just want to add this in there. One more question. Sure. So many different athletes are like what they call, muscle driven athletes, very concentric, driven, good accelerators, but not very good bouncers. How would that play into like training?
Well, what's the goal?
I guess if you were to look at a weak link for a muscle driven, really good accelerator right out of the blocks, or good team sport athlete, they're not very bouncy. So maybe you work more towards what you're saying, the connective end of the spectrum.
You can, but so let's keep in mind, there's a reason that fullbacks are fullbacks in the NFL.
Genetics.
Well, yeah, it's like you're predisposed by structure to be better at something than you are at something else. So it would be very rare to have. So a fullback is a great accelerator, but lousy top end speed, right? Because he's just not physically constructed for it, right? And then every once in a while, you get this one guy that can actually change his shape enough that he becomes the greatest of all time. So that's Barry Sanders. So Barry Sanders, great accelerator, great top end speed. But if you watch him on video, watch the shape change in his body. Like, look at how he behaves when he has to make short accelerations or changes of direction, and then watch him at top end speed. It's like you will see a physical shape that takes place that allows him to do those things, right? That's why wide receivers are wide receivers, right? They're not designed to be fullbacks.
Yeah, they bend.
Physical structure points you in the right direction. If I'm talking about horses and I'm looking at a Clydesdale or I'm looking at a thoroughbred, who's faster? Thoroughbred's faster because they're just built for it, but they don't have the force output that a Clydesdale does. So they don't drag the wagons around. The Clydesdales do, right? So whether you like it or not, there's certain things that you're going to be good at, and there's going to be certain things that you're not good at. Some people are great high jumpers and lousy shot putters.
You could ruin athletes almost then if you do the wrong thing.
Welcome to the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's many people that pursue things that they're not physically designed for, and then we end up seeing them in the purple room because they're doing stuff that again they just weren't meant to be, right? And they might pursue them, or they want to pursue them, or they enjoy certain activities. You can't do things. It's just that you have to start to recognize, it's like, you know what, maybe this isn't what I was cut out to be. Like, you know, some people should be marathon runners and not offensive tackles.
Absolutely.
I mean, we can look at that extreme, but now let's look at the small gradients in between. It's like we have differences that we have to respect.
Yeah.
And so your job is to figure out, okay, based on your physical structure, if you want to do this activity, what is going to be the best way for you to do it, the most effective way for you to do it, and the safest way for you to do it. And that's why this job is hard.
Yeah, no kidding, because you're training high schoolers and you can't even get them to like pay attention half the time anyway.
Well, that's just a dose of reality for you.
Absolutely.
That's part of the job that, it comes with the territory, right?
Yeah. So, will this be recorded for me to rewatch?
It is recorded. It will be posted, and you will be famous.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Great to talk to you. Have a great day.
Bye.